Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us. And we're continuing our journey through the Daodejing. And currently we are in chapter 60. So we're making some good progress. After today, there's only going to be 20 chapters left, if you can believe that. So we're definitely making our way through this. Let's go ahead and get started with today's chapter. And this is making reference to probably one of the more famous quotes from the Tao Te Ching. And you have to let me know if you've heard this before. Rule a great state as you cook a small fish. Anybody hear this one before? Well, in certain circles, this comes up a fair amount. So it's kind of an interesting quote. Certainly, maybe a little bit unexpected. But what would be your guess as to how this analogy works?
Very carefully.
That was
Yes.
going to be my same sentiment. Very carefully.
Yeah, if you fuss with it too much, it's going to fall apart, right? You can't you got to be a lot more hands off, which makes a lot of sense for what we've been seeing in terms of the Taoist approach to thinking about governance, is that there's a lot of confidence in the people to be able to do what they need to do if you simply provide them what they need in terms of a context and you don't interfere too much. So this obviously makes a lot of sense there. There's one other aspect that I think really comes out here with this particular statement. Um, what do you think might be a secondary or another key aspect of this analogy?
Probably best in an air fryer.
Maybe not during the Warring States period, but yes, a contemporary stance, it's best to rule by throwing everybody in an air fryer.
Nice and crispy.
Mm.
I'm, my mind's going to low heat, and I know there's something connected there. I just can't. My mind's not making the connection of what it is, but basically, like, don't overcook the fish. And it's in the same way of like, don't overburden. I don't know how to. The words are not coming to my head yet.
Yeah, yeah. No, I hear you. Something about the heat, not turning up the heat on the people. Yeah. The other piece that I'm thinking here that's important, and we've seen this kind of brought up a couple of different times, is paying attention to the small things. That there's a lot of emphasis on in other chapters that you want to address an issue while it's small. Don't wait for it to get big. So it's a lot of paying attention to the details, and the small things matter. Is a fairly consistent theme that we see through the book as well. And certainly, if you're taking your time to actually cook a small fish, that's paying attention to some detail, and maybe something that other people just would ignore. Maybe they would just go on and say, well, we're just going to deal with the big fish because, it's going to feed more people, or it's more bang for the buck, so to speak. So the attention to detail, I think, is key, and also potentially making reference to who would be interested in cooking a small fish. So that type of person might be somebody who's doesn't have much in the way of options. Maybe this is the only thing they have for food, right? So there's an idea about the what we could call maybe the small people, right? The people that are mostly overlooked, that there's still that attention even to this particular class of people, as well as how you go about dealing with the question of governing and being more non-interfering in how they go. So it's going to continue with what you would expect: through the way, or through Tao, take a ruler's place in the world. Now, Roberts, who's doing this particular translation we're using today, tends to be a little bit more like sing-songy in the way that he does his interpretation. He tries to be more poetic or bring out more of a poetic flair in what he says. So he's going to state things a little bit, maybe different than we would normally speak things. He's trying to capture maybe a little bit of that flair that's in the original text. So here, when he's talking about, how we move into or how somebody would fulfill that role of the ruler, that it's definitely from the perspective of somebody who's recognizing the Tao, understanding the patterns and how those work when they're in that position of rulership. And so we start off then with the idea of more of a hands-off, very gentle attention to detail, watching the patterns as a way we think about how rulership of even a great state, so we're not talking about just like a small village, but even in a very large context, you treat it as though it's small. Even though you got this larger scale, it's still addressing it as though you would at that smaller level. And then we're going to walk into a minefield. And the ghosts of the dead shall have no force. So, what's going on here? This seems very out of place with the rest of what we've seen. But let me play out a couple of lines here, and then we'll start to wrestle with what this might mean. So, and the ghosts of the dead shall have no force. Is it that they have no force, or that their force can do no harm? That their force can do no harm, or that the wise Lord does no harm? Nor ghost, nor wise Lord doing harm. What are your thoughts on this?
So my mind kind of goes to the thoughts of not quite tradition, but because the people of your past did something certain ways, people do it because they did it. And it's like, well, they're not here anymore, so why not change it? Or, just like my kind of thought goes to like forefathers think type of thing of like, oh, our forefathers did this 200 years ago. And it's like, well, that was 200 years ago. And it's some of their stuff no longer counts or has the same weight as it did 200 years ago. So why are we still holding on to it? Like that's the type of thing kind of come into my
interesting
tank.
So the dead are still with us in the sense of the traditions that are still guiding the way that we behave. And so you're looking at this passage as maybe a way of breaking free from tradition. Is that what I'm hearing?
In a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. Anybody else have some thoughts?
Oh no, it's like an ominous riddle. So not really sure what they're going for.
Yeah. I hadn't really thought about it in the way that Chaz had brought up, but that, you could also think of it as, if people were leaving behind the more ancestral traditions, maybe walking it. So we've kind of talked about the philosophical perspective of Taoism maybe being rooted in more of that Paleolithic or indigenous worldview that's being reintroduced. And so maybe some of the thought is even that as people have walked away from those ancestor traditions, it's maybe brought harm, right? That we've forgotten the things that make us more in tune with reality or with nature. And in doing so, we've caused harm. Could be another way we think about this from that ancestor possession or in thinking about it in terms of tradition. Both of those are very interesting, I think.
I wonder if it might be more aspirational than actual.
Fill that out a little bit for me.
Well, that it's stating a goal, but not necessarily a reality, not a present reality.
And so what do you see as kind of how the goal works in the way that they're phrasing this?
Well, it would be nice if the pernicious aspects of the past weren't carried on from generation to generation, but the reality is they are.
Mm. So still looking at that as a way of talking about tradition. Mm-hmm. So we also know that there is definitely worldviews that different people have that actually include the idea of ghosts. Um, so anybody have some thoughts if we're talking about actual ghosts in this context, what they might be referring to?
Well, you know, I don't know what I know people personally who swear they have seen ghosts,
Mm.
and certainly in near death experiences, there's a lot of evidence of dead figures emerging to help someone enter the the new realm.
Mm. Yeah, and both in China and some of the other Asian cultures, they definitely had more of an ancestor type of a worship where they had a feeling that their, um, you know, ancestors were continuing on in some way and potentially having an impact on the present. Um, Now, that's not been the position we've seen so far with the Taoist, but assuming there's a cultural aspect where there's, so like in our modern day society, we can have um, secular aspects of our culture actually making reference to things like angels or heaven or God or whatever, not in the sense that they are coming from that themselves, but they're making reference to more cultural ways of thinking or talking about things. So something along those lines could be happening here as well. But if there is an allusion that's being made to more of these, let's say, folk traditions or folk religions, how would that potentially play out in this discussion?
If you're a bad ruler, then your ancestors will haunt you.
Okay.
And there's the biblical notion of the cloud of witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, who is the wise lord that they're trying to reference here? Is that a leader?
So we started off talking about who would actually step into the role of ruling, right? And the idea was that the ideal ruler would be one that's essentially like a sage king or a sage emperor. And so I think that in the case here, what he's translating wise lord would be in reference to like a sage king, an ideal type of Taoist ruler.
It's
Definitely.
giving me like oh my God, the A Christmas Story or
Oh,
whatever one is the ghost of the past, the ghost of the present, the ghost of the future, whatever.
mm-hmm.
I was thinking of the movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze and the guy in the subway who shows him how to touch stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that the idea that was brought up of the ruler, how they act, there might be the concern about the ancestors fighting back against them doing something wrong, that they could disturb, in a sense, the dead in some way that would cause them to act. Uh, a lot of similar concepts to how this has been looked at from a lot of different interpretations and perspectives. I think that the one that has made the most sense to me and maybe isn't as obvious, that holds a little bit more true to what we've seen thus far in terms of the Daodejing being much more of a naturalist type of an approach to reality, is the relationship that and this might not be quite the right word, but how religion and society or culture, or let's say a political entity, relate to each other. And one of the ways that this has been looked at is the question of harsh rulerships, or when a government, some type of ruling oppressive force is in play, what types of things do the people turn to? One of the things that was interesting is we hear or have heard frequently the quote from Karl Marx that religion is the opiate of the people. And we think of that frequently in terms of this is something that Marx was saying as a critique against religion. But if it's looked at in the larger context of what he's talking about, it's actually more of a critique against the different types of rulership, because it's talking about how people have to withdraw into something separate in order to cope with what's going on in the harsh reality of their political environment. So it's a way of, in the same way that somebody might find themselves more vulnerable to drugs and alcohol if they're living in a world that doesn't have any real hope for them, or they don't see any purpose or what's going on, they can tend to self-medicate. Another thing that Marx would say is that people withdraw into more of a fantasy world or focus on something that's more of an other world or afterlife, because this life has become so dysfunctional that there's not really any place for them. So you have a very interesting way that sometimes, or at least in some political thinking, that religion and the state operate. And one of them is that the relationship is a bit more intentional, that as the state wants to have more power and control, it can take advantage of religious sensibilities, because it can take the eyes off of what is the emperor doing and looking at the current situation as much more temporary, or maybe something that's not the ultimate reality, something where we don't need to be paying as much attention to that, because the ultimate goal, the ultimate reality, is something that happens after we die, or in another world where justice actually happens, and the people who are currently being so oppressive will get what's coming to them, but that we're actually going to find ourselves ultimately in the good place, right? In various forms. There's a lot of different ways that different religions talk about this.
And
So,
yet, Jim, I would say
Mhm.
the antithesis of what you're saying would be the destruction of the Soviet Union, where the intent was to eliminate religion. And yet the reality is that the Catholic Church was probably the single most powerful force in overturning the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so you can have things function in a very opposite way as well. So the religious sensibilities can also function to galvanize a critique against force as well. That whole prophetic tradition of speaking truth to power, or helping to maybe more that apocalyptic idea of how do you reveal what's going on, like behind the curtain, seeing who's actually in control, or that all the glitz and glamour that the empire happens to offer that tries to entice you is really just a ruse that's covering up all the dark and disgusting things that are happening behind the curtain, so to speak. So yeah, there can definitely be counter forces with religion and the state and how they operate. But there's
And
definitely
that's why I think the Marxist critique is so simplistic and just doesn't correspond to reality as we've seen it.
Well, I think we've seen both things, right? We've definitely seen, you brought up the Christian tradition. One of the fascinating maneuvers that we see in the history there is how it essentially gets co-opted by Rome. Whereas initially it was a very sharp critique against Rome, when Rome essentially embraces Christianity, it denatures it by distorting what it is. It makes the true enemy not actually the emperor, but spiritual forces, right? And it takes the mind away from being concerned about how it's being exercised by the state, and more about kind of an afterlife perspective. And then you start seeing Christianity, which was being used as a force of peace, being something that was being used for conquest. Um, there's you just see examples all over the place of how these things go back and forth. Small pockets where the religious tradition can actually give you strength against the state, and other places where the state actually takes advantage of religion to basically pacify the people. So
That's all I'm saying, is that the Marxist critique is inadequate, insufficient. It doesn't tell the whole story.
yeah, it's kind of focusing on one side of it for sure.
Yeah.
But in this case, obviously, this is a much earlier time, and they didn't have access to those historical events that we were just talking about. But we can start to see, if we're thinking about it from this perspective, that one, we could see a question about, if things are going bad in my life, if my social situation is such that there's a lot of disruption going on, there's a question to ask, why or who's responsible? And in cases where it's not comfortable, to suggest that maybe it's the empire, and maybe because there's a lot of potential threat you would have to deal with by simply thinking such a thing, it might be easier to think of it in terms that are more like the ancestors in this case, that if something's going wrong in my life, there must be other forces that are involved. If I'm not allowed psychologically to question the hierarchical structures of things, my mind might jump to other things that become easier, in a sense, to address. And the consequences of that then would be, how do we engage with these other forces? How do we appease them? Which could turn into more of this, well, how do we care for our ancestors, or make sure that they're properly remembered, or maintaining those traditions in such a way that we pacify the malicious, let's say, activity of the dead. Lots of different ways that this could go. But what's interesting, if we are thinking about it from more of this perspective, the implication is that if the ruler is ruling from more of that sage perspective, where it's not becoming oppressive, it's not interfering, and is doing a little bit more of that hands-off approach, then it's not causing that kind of harm to the people. And when that kind of harm is not being caused to the people, then the power or the potential influence of this idea of the dead interfering with things loses its power. It doesn't have the same appeal, because they're not dealing in such an oppressive situation. One other thing that, Rob, you brought to mind is an interesting aspect of how demons were talked about from a Christian perspective. And there's a lot of various studies on this, but one of them is showing how their talk of demons and oppression was actually a way of talking about what Rome was doing in their occupation of Palestine. And it was a way of describing what that literally, that idea of being oppressed by that other power that's causing you to have to do things you wouldn't want to do. And then if we see in some other interesting historical developments of that, what is it? Franz Fanon, I think it was, wrote a book. What was it called? The Weapons of the Weak, something like that. But he's addressing what was happening with the French occupation of Algiers. And actually, yeah, it was that part. And there was an interesting way in which the native inhabitants were referring to these different generals as demons. They took on, the demons had the names of these different generals. So it's another kind of interesting historical situation that we can see, where the oppression from the political aspect was getting manifest in ways that were talked about in more supernatural terms to help try and explain or help give some way to make sense out of the suffering that was happening. So the idea, especially at the end here, where it says that the wise Lord is doing no harm, could relate back to this idea that these supernatural forces that could be defaulting to in terms of how we talk about this oppressive state that we find ourselves in a sense, loses its power. That if you have the wise sage king that's operating in the way that they're suggesting at the beginning here, there isn't that temptation to resort to these other ways of trying to make sense out of that pain and suffering.
I don't know though, Jim. I think you kind of are imposing your naturalist view on the text in order to diminish the supernatural realm that may actually be there in the text.
Well, certainly that's possible. One of the things we would have to look at is, how does the rest of the text as a whole look at or deal with that situation? And I think it's pretty clear from most of the scholars that it's coming from a fairly naturalistic perspective, not in the sense of how we would use that term in our modern sense, but in a way that seems to be much more focused on a purely philosophical aspect. And what they're seeing here with this passage is actually another move towards naturalism, because it's taking away the actual force or power that something like this idea of ghosts would actually have. It might not be stated in the way that we would find the easiest to understand, but there's definitely a movement that is detected here away from the idea of ghosts of the ancestors actually interfering or having an effect on what's going on, and a redirect back to the issues of suffering to the actions of the ruler versus malicious spirits. So, but obviously people have taken this in many different ways. This isn't the only way it can be taken. And the reason I think it resonates more for me, obviously I'm coming from a naturalist perspective, but also I think it fits a bit better with what we've seen in the rest of the text as well. So I'm just going to show a couple of other thoughts here from other commentators on this, but let's finish out the actual text of the chapter. There's just actually one more line after this. And again, this is Robert's translation, and it is a little bit how should I put it? He tries to do it more poetically, more kind of sing-songy. So the final line here might seem a little bit odd. So if we go back, then we see the opening statement about how the great state should be governed as you cook a small fish, this idea that you don't mess with it too much. It's more of a hands-off. It's not a heavy influence or heavily involved, as we've seen in several other of the chapters dealing with how that you should govern from a Taoist perspective. And that we go through this issue about if the ruler is causing no harm, this issue of the ghost things seems to lose its power. Then it says, when the world is governed in accordance with Tao, spiritual influences. Oh, you know what? I take it back. I am jumping into a slightly different translation here. Pardon me. I lost where my slides were going. So we're looking at essentially this section of the text. We're going to look at another translation of this. And it's kind of funny because Dane, I think, brought this up last week about the Daodejing, which is a really kind of an interesting translation. There's two different aspects that they go through in the Daodejing. One is very much a translation that's consistent with how you think of like the Big Lebowski and how that whole thing unfolds. But then they actually also in the larger text give a serious translation of the Daodejing as well. And I'm going to look at actually now this same section that we're looking at in the translation from the Daodejing. Says, when the world is governed in accordance with the Tao, spiritual influences no longer find any purchase. It's not that spiritualism loses any power, only that it no longer has any effect on the people. So we can see in this translation, they're also bringing out this very similar idea of how they're understanding the movement that's happening in terms of taking away the force of that appeal to that spiritualism when the rulership is done in the right way. And we'll come back to this too with another translation that's not necessarily associated with the Daodejing, but I just thought, wow, this is actually really spot on with where a lot of these other scholars were going. So, you know, hats off to the dude.
I noticed that too when I was reading a few, when I first discovered that it existed, there were a few examples. I was like, well, actually, that's surprisingly pretty good
Yeah.
for the theme of this.
It's definitely a fun translation to look at. Okay, so then this is the final line of the text, going back to Roberts and more of that poetic way of talking about things. It says, to their joint virtue, and this is the word here, thus redounds, redounds. Not again the way that any of us would probably say this, but there's something about how they're working together. And the question is, who's working together? Is this talking about the spirits and the wise Lord, or is this talking about the spirit or about the wise Lord and the people? But in one of these two connections, the idea is that Da is magnified, that it grows. And if we think about the concept of Da being more of this natural way of demonstrating or modeling the Tao, these patterns, these natural ways of being in the world. So there's more of the spontaneous, natural way of being, which is what Da is getting at. It's saying that that's going to grow when we see whatever two forces we're talking about here, either the people and the ruler working together in a way that's not causing harm, or if you're talking about the spirit and the ruler. So again, you've got a big split between how they understand what two parties are being referred to here. But if we look at more of a literal translation of this last line, it says, these two don't hurt each other, therefore Da returns. Now, one of the scholars that's definitely pretty significant is older. I have a hard time understanding exactly how to pronounce the last name, but I'm just going to bring up a quote from him on this. But he's making the case that very specifically, these two must refer to the ruler and the people. So I guess it's maybe like Duvendak or Duvendek, something like that. I'm not sure how you would pronounce his name. So again, you have a very minimalistic text that requires a certain amount of interpretation that goes into how it's understood. And at least part of the academic tradition is recognizing or suggesting that the two must refer to the ruler and the people, even though others would say that it's talking about the spirits and the ruler. But I think that what we're seeing then, if the flow is correct, that it's presenting the ideal way of rulership that should be more hands-off, and that when the ruler is not causing harm, then the people's appeal to or the power of the spiritual loses its power, then it seems to make more sense that these two is relating to the people and the ruler, so that there is a harmony that's able to flourish because of that. But again, you will see the exact opposite interpretation that's part of what makes this book fun, is it it is very minimalistic in how it says things, which opens the door to get you to think and to question and to wrestle with the different ideas.
Could one make the case, Jim, that the Tao is more favorably disposed toward a libertarian, hands-off capitalism as opposed to an interventionist socialism?
Well, those would be definitely modern categories, but it is an interesting question. There's aspects of it that would seem to fit more with a kind of a democratic approach, in the sense that it envisions a great deal of, let's say, respect for the people being able to know how to manage themselves, which could look at, more of a hands-off approach that you see with libertarianism. But at the same time, there's a lot of emphasis on understanding the interrelatedness of all the various systems that are involved, and how humans find themselves in the systems, not apart from the systems. And so that the efforts of the ruler are to help maintain or keep those systems in balance so that people can thrive, which could also be looked at from more of a socialist concern of recognizing that there's a lot of social constructs and forces that are in play in how people experience their lives. So I think, there's aspects of both of them that could be looked at. I think that the capitalist part would probably be a little bit more ruled out as well, because there's a heavy emphasis on not chasing after riches and that kind of thing, because that creates conflict, as well as the idea of seeing actual hierarchies between people as opposed to simply different offices. So it's not going to be a clean matchup with any of our modern day boxes that we use for ways of organizing things politically, but I think you'll be able to see different aspects that resonate with a lot of the different possible boxes that we've created in modern day political thinking.
Doesn't it also say keep their bellies empty and their heads, or no, keep their bellies full and their heads empty?
Yes, it does.
That could have various
Yeah.
interpretations.
Yeah, so there's definitely this aspect of, what is it that the people need, and they need to be fed, right? They need to have in a sense, their more basic needs actually met, but the empty heads is looked at in various ways. So some people will try to say that Taoism is presenting a little bit more of a know-nothing type of an approach, whereas others would say that the things that we want to keep from filling the heads are actually more of the socially derived or constructed ways of thinking about things and values. So it's an emptying the mind of more of the social constructs, as opposed to not knowing anything. It's more about how do we see more clearly by removing more of those filters that are coloring the way that we see the world, so that we can see it more directly as it is. But yeah, that's another passage for sure, Dane, that
Seems to parallel the concept of bread and circus.
well, if
Their
you look
bellies
at it
full and their
that
minds
way,
empty.
yeah, I mean, you could look at it that way in the sense of distraction. But I don't think that that's exactly where the Taoists were
I
going.
don't think it means that either. I'm just saying that various things could be interpreted into it. That's why this is why I consider the Daodejing to be so brilliant, because it's it's like a minimal oracle, in a sense. An oracle being something that has Stan Groff actually defines an oracle as being something that's sufficiently complex to reflect the contents of the unconscious mind back at you. So, like a Rorschach blot, for example, it's complex random shapes that have the ability to reflect back whatever's in your subconscious, and you can take a work like the Bible, which is very complex and also like very large, and there's enough stuff in there that you can it'll reflect back to you pretty much anything that's already in your subconscious. But the Tao Te Ching accomplishes the same thing by being very, very small. It's very small and very minimal, yet it still has that property that you can find a passage in there to support almost anything if you interpret it in a certain way.
Yeah.
I think what Dane has been describing would be has been in some measure captured in contemporary China too. That's kind of the devil's bargain that's happened there. The people's standard of living has been raised appreciably, but the price they've been willing to pay for that is the acceptance of an authoritarian regime that can't be questioned.
Yeah, I mean, contemporary China is very different from ancient China. But yeah, it's interesting to see how things have unfolded. I don't think we could rightfully say that that would be a consequence of them embracing Taoism, but there's a lot of other forces that are involved in especially modern day China, but including Confucianism and Buddhism, and then what happened with the Maoist regime, and also the what do they call it? The People's Revolution happened in the 60s. Definitely had a strong impact on how a lot of these things shaped modern China.
The cultural revolution, maybe you mean.
The Cultural Revolution, yes, thank you. So, yeah, but to Dane's point, it is one of the things that I find really fascinating with it is so minimalistic, and it cannot be made sense of without bringing an interpretation to it. It does have the ability to really cause the reader to engage, to wrestle with the ideas, and to try and figure out how they make sense of it. And maybe one of the things that's fascinating looking at the variety of translations that happen is it helps to reveal a lot of where the different interpreters are coming from. And to Rob's point, how much of my naturalism is coming into play and how I'm interpreting, right? It's going to happen for all of us. And I think that's an unavoidable, but also a benefit to what this does, is it allows us to engage with some ideas. And hopefully I'm being clear that I don't see this as the only possible interpretation, but I'm giving some reasons why I think it's a valid interpretation, but also recognizing that people see it in a variety of ways.
It reminds me a little, Jim, of the description of the great classical pianist Alfred Brendel, who would play Beethoven, and his critics would say that you would hear more Brendel than Beethoven. And I think, that's kind of how we come at almost any sacred text. We can often hear more of ourselves than the text.
Yeah. Well, and
the way it functions as an oracle is if you just open to a random page and read it, and like either as a daily practice to meditate on, or just if you're facing some kind of dilemma or something, you can just pretty much open to a random page and read that, and it'll have some kind of bearing or some kind of interpretation on what you're dealing with, at least enough to maybe shake an idea loose or something like that.
But I think that's a bit of a fool's errand, because you have to understand the cultural context, and you don't just open the page and get that.
No, well, no, you don't. I'm saying that you can open, even if you didn't know anything about Chinese history, you could open the Daodejing to a random page and read it, and it would be likely to have some kind of meaning to relevant to whatever you're dealing with, just because it's so vague, basically, without having to know anything about it. It will trigger some kind of idea based on what's already in your head and what you're dealing with.
Yeah, kind of a disruption to get you out of your normal
pattern interrupt.
Yeah, it causes you to reflect, and this is always going to be a question, like, does what the historical author, like what they meant when they were writing it, to what degree is that actually the goal? So sometimes when you're talking like more of an oracle, the point is, well, it doesn't really matter because the point of it is to, again, interrupt your normal flow of thought to get you to reconsider things from different perspectives. The I Ching is definitely something that functions along those same lines. Another thing that predates the Daodejing.
There are a lot of things like that, even now, like a fortune cookie,
Yeah,
horoscopes, tarot cards, things like that. Like people are quick to dismiss them because, oh, it's a horoscope. It's, it doesn't mean anything. But even if it doesn't have any science behind it, if it gets you to think about something from a different perspective that you're experiencing, like Dane said, the vagueness of it, like it's vague enough that it might relate to something in your life that you can think about a little bit differently, and it may still help you.
Yeah, absolutely. And to Rob's point, for me, I tend to have more of a concern about what was actually intended in the writing, and that's why I spend a lot of time trying to understand the history and the culture and the language to put some guardrails on possible interpretations. You brought up the air fryer earlier. Obviously, that couldn't be part of a historical interpretation because it wouldn't be relevant to that time. So I probably tend to try and push for more of that historical intent of what the authors were going after, but it certainly still has that value that Dane is talking about in terms of causing our imagination to get engaged and to have to bring something to the text. You can't just, it's not sufficient in itself. We're going to bring something to it, whether we're trying to bring that historical and cultural context to the text or my own personal issues or questions or things that I'm wrestling with. So it's very dynamic, and it's fascinating in such a brief and very minimalistic text, like Dane was saying, how powerful it is at triggering thought.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I just want to bring up one last quote here. Now, this is a Chinese writer from more of the Middle Ages that was actually much more influential in terms of bringing back around more of a Zen perspective. In China, it was originally called Chan, but Chan is essentially a Taoist interpretation of Buddhism that flourished in China. And when it was exported to Japan, Chan is actually translated or maybe even pronounced as Zen. So Zen Buddhism is a Taoist bent on India's Buddhism. Anyway, this is one of the things that he had to say in reference to this. He says, a cruel government brings calamity down on the people. The people, however, think their suffering is the work of ghosts and spirits and turn to sacrifice and worship to improve their lot, when actually their misfortune is caused by their rulers. So just another one of the scholarly approaches that's looking at this text from that more naturalizing view. But absolutely, it can be looked at different. So anyway, there you go.
I'd call that more Marxist than Zen, Jim.
Well, this is before Marx, and
I know, I understand.
He's definitely viewed as more of a Zen proponent. But in any case, yeah, we got a couple minutes left if you have any final thoughts. I think this has been an example of how the minimalist brings out some fun conversation and the different ways that we've all been approaching this.
Very good, lively conversation. I've appreciated it.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? All right, well, we'll go ahead and bring this to a close then. If you've been watching this video and you'd like to be a part of our live Zoom discussion, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get links to the live Zoom conversation as well as an invitation to where we meet in person if you happen to be in the Southern California area. So thank you again for coming by today, and hope to see you all next week.
Thanks, Jen.